Hello, constitutional law scholars. Welcome to this PracticePerfect review on Congress's spending power. Under Article 1, Section 8, Congress has the power, quote, to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States, end quote. Today, this means that Congress can spend money on nearly anything it wishes. It also means that Congress can allocate money to the states on the condition that they adopt certain policies, even when Congress could not enact those policies itself. In other words, Congress's spending power is much broader than its other enumerated powers, in particular, its power to regulate the interstate economy under the Commerce Clause. As a result, Congress can use its spending power to encourage states to regulate activities that Congress could not directly regulate itself. This lesson explores Congress's power to spend under Article 1, Section 8. We'll start with the history and evolution of this power, then we'll take a look at how it applies today. The touchstone of Congress's spending power is the, quote, general welfare, end quote. Congress can spend money on the general welfare, but it cannot spend money not on the general welfare. So what is this general welfare? The debate over the scope of the general welfare goes all the way back to our nation's founding, in particular, to a dispute between James Madison and Alexander Hamilton. On the one hand, Madison argued that the general welfare was limited by Congress's other powers in Article 1, Section 8. According to Madison, Congress could only spend to the extent allowable by its other enumerated powers, like the Commerce Clause. On the other hand, Hamilton argued that the general welfare included any purpose that Congress thought served, well, the general welfare. By this reckoning, Congress could spend money on nearly anything, so long as Congress determined the spending to serve the general welfare, whether it fell within Congress's other Article 1, Section 8 powers or not. The difference mattered. Madison's approach would have sharply limited Congress's power to spend as compared to Hamilton's approach. Hamilton's approach would give Congress nearly free rein over its power to spend. For example, Madison's approach would have limited Congress's power to spend money on only those activities that Congress could regulate under its Commerce Clause power. Hamilton's approach, in sharp contrast, would allow Congress to spend money on any activities, even activities that Congress could not regulate under the Commerce Clause. The Supreme Court sided with Hamilton. In United States v. Butler, the court specifically recounted the debate and ruled that Hamilton's position was, quote, the correct one, end quote. The court in subsequent cases affirmed this holding. As a result, the court today reads the general welfare to mean whatever Congress says, and Congress can spend money on activities even if it could not directly regulate those activities. More generally, the court in Butler ruled that Congress could not provide subsidies to farmers to limit their crops. Congress enacted the subsidies in the Agriculture Adjustment Act in order to prop up agricultural prices and to ensure continued production. But the court said that this violated the 10th Amendment because Congress was regulating production, not interstate commerce. Subsequently, the court did not follow this aspect of the ruling. See the videos on Congress's Commerce Clause power and the 10th Amendment for more. Today, the court continues to interpret Congress's spending power expansively. Congress can spend money on nearly any activity it wishes, even if Congress may not be able to regulate that activity directly. For example, Congress could spend money to aid with local disasters, or to subsidize individuals' food purchases, or to subsidize housing, among other things. Moreover, Congress can use its spending power to provide money directly to the states. As a condition of receipt of those funds, Congress can require that the states adopt certain policies. Because of the broad sweep of the General Welfare Clause, Congress can use this, quote, conditioned spending, end quote, power to effect policies through the states that Congress could not enact directly. This conditioned spending power is a critical tool that Congress uses to effect a wide variety of policies today. But there are some limits on Congress's conditioned spending power. The Supreme Court has identified 4 requirements for a valid conditioned spending program. First, Congress's spending program must be in the general welfare. Again, this is a very loose standard. The courts defer substantially to Congress in determining what is in the general welfare. As a result, Congress can spend money on nearly anything it wants. Second, any conditions on congressional spending must be clear and unambiguous. This requirement also means that Congress cannot impose post-acceptance or retroactive conditions on federal spending. This requirement allows states to exercise their option to accept federal funding with full knowledge of the conditions that come with that funding. Third, Congress's interests in the conditions on federal spending must be related to Congress's interests in the underlying spending program itself. For example, the court ruled in South Dakota v. Dole, 1987, that Congress could condition a state's receipt of federal highway funds on its adoption of a 21-year-old drinking age. The court said that Congress's interest in a nationwide, uniform 21-year-old drinking age was sufficiently related, indeed, quote, directly related, to one of its principal interests in federal highway spending, safe interstate travel. Let's imagine another example. Suppose that Congress conditioned the receipt of federal law enforcement funds on a state's adoption of certain educational standards in the public schools. Is the condition sufficiently related to the underlying program? Probably not. Congress's interest in a federal law enforcement program is probably not directly related to its interest in public education standards. Finally, the conditioned spending program cannot violate any other constitutional provision. Most importantly for our purposes, the conditioned spending program cannot violate the 10th Amendment and federalism principles. This means that the conditioned spending program can encourage states to accept federal funds with the attendant conditions, but the program cannot effectively coerce states to participate. This is the same anti-commandeering principle that comes from the 10th Amendment and federalism. For example, the court in South Dakota v. Dole upheld a conditioned spending program in which a state stood to lose just 5% of its total federal highway funds if it declined to adopt a 21-year-old drinking age. The court held that this program was not impermissibly coercive. Instead, it offered only, quote, relatively mild encouragement to the states, end quote. The court noted that 5% of the state's federal highway funds amounted to less than 0.5% of the state's total budget at the time. But more recently, in NFIB versus Sebelius, the court struck a conditioned spending program because the program effectively compelled the states to participate. In that case, Congress offered states additional funding to expand their existing Medicaid programs as part of the Affordable Care Act. But the act also allowed the government to withhold a state's entire pre-existing Medicaid allotment if a state declined to expand its Medicaid program consistent with the act. Because pre-existing federal funding for Medicaid programs was so significant to the states, quote, over 10% of a state's overall budget, end quote, the court said that as a practical matter, states had to agree to the new expansion. The court held that this expansion therefore effectively coerced states to participate in violation of this fourth requirement. Let's take a look at a different program. Congress enacted Title IX, a law that withholds federal education funds from a state educational institution that discriminates by sex in educational programs or activities. But Title IX only withholds the particular federal funds that support the offending program, not a state's entire allotment of federal educational funds. Is this condition impermissibly coercive? Probably not. Title IX only withholds the particular funds that support an offending program, not a state's entire allotment of federal educational funds, and so Title IX probably does not run afoul of the principle in NFIB versus Sebelius. In sum, Congress has broad power to spend money in the general welfare. The power is not bound by Congress's other enumerated powers, and as a result, Congress can spend money on activities that it might not have the power to regulate directly. Moreover, Congress's spending power includes the authority to provide federal funding to the states on the condition that the states adopt certain policies. This conditioned spending power allows Congress to effect policies and regulations through the states that it could not otherwise adopt directly. Conditioned spending programs are a critical means by which Congress effects a variety of policies today. Thank you for watching this Practice Perfect review. We recommend that you take our quiz on congressional spending power to solidify your knowledge.